Well, it's morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast. I've got a fantastic guest for you today from my hometown, Houston, Texas, Jerry Fu, and he's actually in the medical industry, and he is a conflict resolution coach for Asian American leaders. I'm really excited to talk about this, particularly as an ABC myself, and the things we deal with in our culture and background, and happy to have him to fill in the gap. So, Jerry, welcome.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me. Excited for our conversation.
Yeah, briefly introduce yourself and we'll dive right into the questions.
Certainly. So, yeah, I started off as a pharmacist and worked for a chain for a little bit because my mom insisted that working for a chain pharmacy was a stability my dad never had, despite having two master's degrees, one in chemical engineering and the second in computer science. And so, after 5 years, I said no more. And I took a teaching job through a pharmacy consulting company where I moved from Tennessee down to Houston for and then proceeded to get fired and then had lots of rough patches with my career between bounced paychecks, crooked bosses, crooked doctors. And then what I like to tell people is that leadership saved my career. I was invited to help facilitate some leadership material through a pharmacy leadership nonprofit. And that gave me the confidence to take on more management positions because I began to change my thinking about who I could become as a leader. And after a while, I said, you know what? I'm still sick of dealing with insurance claims and prescription drama, as I'm sure you can relate. And so I said, I want to focus on people development. So I said, I want to be a coach, but I had no idea how to start to build a business. And it wasn't until I got formal coach training at Rice as the pandemic ramped up where I realized I wanted to put this dream in motion. So now I still straddle two fences, one as a pharmacy manager in the central Houston area and also building up my leadership coaching business in the process. So that's where things are.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic segue. And one thing we really love is basically Asian Americans, professionals, or well known in the science, STEM, or medicine, engineering, all these. The problem, really, I won't say problem, but you don't really see a lot of leaders.
Yeah.
But we got Jensen Wong and Lisa Sue. But how do cultural backgrounds influence? Why do you see not very many Asian American leaders? Talk about them.
Yeah. Part of culture that we grow up in is a merit-based culture, right? Where we say work hard enough and someone who is important will notice you and then tap you on the shoulder and bring you up with the leadership, right? That is basically what we're told. Earn your way into more income or more prestige. And you realize that doesn't work so well when you get to a country whose culture does not function the same way that as the one that we grew up in, right? So one of my examples I'll give is there's an engineer from China who came over here, software engineer who worked for a big online retailer, and he just got frustrated because he goes, I came from a command and control family and a command and control work environment where I was in China. And now I come here and I see people who slack off that seem to get more opportunities than I do because they know how to, quote, sell themselves to upper management or look good in front of upper management. People take his credit, people take his opportunities. And so that's one reason, not to point fingers, but it is a territory you have to learn how to navigate well. And that is one reason, right? Because number one, the culture teaches us you need a skilled and profitable profession with prestige, right? Become a physician, become a lawyer, become an engineer. And we realize that the person who's actually important is the one who signs the paychecks for those doctors and engineers and such, right? And so when you start to realize that the thinking you grew up with is no longer the thinking you need to actually be successful in leadership or management, that's when the opportunity for coaches like me to come in and help people make that transition.
Yeah, it's so very well said. And some of the best advice I got growing up from my dad was he was like, learn to work smarter versus harder. Like you can work yourself to death, but if people are, like you said, it's like this culture where it's political maneuvering and backstabbing and just you're able to navigate it. You can do better than just putting your head down and working hard. So one question is for mindset shifts, how can you shift this mindset from, how can Asian American professionals shift this mindset from employees into entrepreneurship, leader? What kind of mindset shifts do they need?
Yeah, that's a very key question. One of the best tips for me was from a leadership book called It's Your Ship by Captain D. Michael Abrashoff. One of the best tips in there that helped me was they challenged their readers to think like your boss. And what they mean by that is to say, what are my boss's needs? What is my boss dealing with? What are my challenges? How do I set my boss up for success in a way to make my boss look good? And so the interesting thing is when you start putting on the hypothetical hat and you start realizing, okay, this is the role I need to play to make sure my boss is set up for success. Then when your boss gets promoted, whether he takes you with him because he realized, hey, this is a good teammate, I want him to come with me, or if, like, he leaves his position vacated and they move you up, you realize, hey, you know what? I already know how to think like my boss. I'm already a bit more prepared than I realized because I started to anticipate needs and imagine what it took to get there beyond the standard job written description. So that was one of the best tips for me, because when you start to expand your thinking, that's basically what unlocks possibilities.
Yeah. Another follow-up question I have for you is, especially conflict resolution, and kind of the stereotype is avoid conflict or just kind of, you know, brush it under the rug. What are key strategies? Because I've had to develop this skill too, is like set boundaries, call people out. And what are key strategies you teach for resolving conflicts effectively? Be firm, but be nice about it. How do you help clients in this area?
Yeah. Incidentally, one of the funniest and most useful phrases I heard from an Inc. article was the style of the velvet fits, to where it's like an iron fist wrapped in velvet. It's firm, but it's also soft on the edges. But that kind of leads to the 5-step framework I usually coach my clients through. Number one is to imagine what a successful conversation would sound like, right? And you have to define that success for yourself. Is it clear expectations? Is it a restoration of trust? Is it a truce, or is it termination? You have to determine what your target is and to believe that is possible. The second is to recognize that the cost of doing nothing is more costly than the effort to try and fail. So the second step I tell people is 10 seconds of courage. 10 seconds of courage to set that boulder in motion, send that text, pick up that phone, send that email, and set that boulder in motion and lock the gate behind you so you can't backtrack or procrastinate or rationalize. And so that's a big step that people realize, hey, you know what? I need to stop letting myself off the hook. The third is to script your critical phrases and to say, hey, you know what? Let me jot down the 2 or 3 main points that I know I need to make in this conversation. Let me anticipate what kind of pushback they're going to give me, and then let me figure out how I can counter the counter. So best way you have an idea of how you need to improvise in case your plan doesn't fit the way you want it to. The fourth step is to rehearse these critical phrases. So that way, get some reps in before you actually get into the game. You train at the dojo before you fight on the street. And that way, you're not tripping over your own words in the middle of the moment and your mind isn't going blank. And then this fifth step and final step is to follow through, right? We want people to say, hey, you know what? I didn't do all this research just to feel good about myself. I did this to try to orchestrate a certain outcome. And so these are some things where people who are conflict diverse, or as I like to say, recovering and relapsing people pleasers like myself, I like to say, you know what? Yeah, failure doesn't mean you're done. Failure means you're not done. And I like to cite the example when I did Victor Brumate, right? If I said, hey, you have to move out, and it just says, make me just sitting there saying, oh, it doesn't fly that well. You have to go until he moves out. So that's one example I usually like to share and remind people of, to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, you're not done as long as the result isn't there.
And one thing that I really loved about your comment is this idea of people pleasing, and it's very prevalent in our culture. And so how do you deal with this? And then I also wanted to, because you mentioned a really beautiful step framework of how to resolve conflicts, and the underlying feelings is like people pleasing, guilt and shame. How do you get over this fear? Like when you're going to speak to somebody and be like, hey, don't do that, or put up a boundary, or call someone out, or sometimes you have to step in and mediate a conflict. How do you deal with these 3 core issues?
Yeah, I think in this culture that says, oh, don't rock the boat, don't upset people, don't antagonize people, you realize you have to strip all that away. And what I mean by that, to do that, you just have to say, you know what, we have to define the problem. And the problem is not the person, the problem is the problem, right? And so then you have to initiate that initial confrontation, say, hey, we're both a part of this, and I'm going to need your help, and I need a conversation around this. Because one of the tough truths that you and I probably have realized is that politeness doesn't solve the problem. Assuming people know what you're thinking also doesn't solve the problem. And so being polite and hoping they figure out what you intend for them to do in high context cultures like ours, where we have to play a lot of cultural games to pass a test that we don't find out we failed until later, right? Oh, I forgot to take my shoes off during a dinner, and now I'm not being called, but I'm not being invited back to dinner again, right? Because they quiet quit us, things like this. And so because to take a business example, right? Like I'll do this. Intel used to be in all the memory chips, and the CEO knew that at the time, hey, we've got microprocessors lined up. IBM wants to buy all these microprocessors from us. And so even though the memory chip business, they were losing market share, it was still profitable. And so all these former employees or current employees that were with the company a while had that identity and revenue stream wrapped up with memory chips. And he had to ask himself, if I got fired and they brought in a replacement, what would he do? And he realized his replacement would not have that emotional attachment to a profitable but dying market stream. And so we realized we're gonna have to commit to this new one. And thankfully, he said, why can't I just do that myself? And so thankfully for him and the company, he made that commitment. And now Intel is still king of that hill. Unlike Continental, which tried to straddle two fences when they tried to copy Southwest's flight revenue model on like smaller airports and one-track planes. When they tried to straddle two fences, the company went bankrupt. And the conflicts that we see here, they're necessary, because these are productive conflicts, because if you don't address them, your company will die by default. And so this is where you realize, hey, conflict isn't something to avoid. Conflict is something that actually reveals truth about difficult situations. And the sooner we recognize difficult truth, the sooner we can do something about it. As you've seen it, right? No one would say, oh, the cancer diagnosis is too harsh and it's very discouraging. Let's just not tell them anything. No, then the patient dies, right? So yeah, just to throw in a health example, because we're both in healthcare. But yeah, that's my answer. You realize quickly, the sooner you deal with the difficult, the sooner you can actually come up with solutions, because you're confident enough to say, hey, you know what, with my toolbox and the help of my team, let's try to actually do something productive about it.
And the follow-up question is, when people come to you for coaching or advice, what do they most commonly come to you for? Is it that they can't progress, or like they can't keep a job just because they can't navigate the politics of the company? Is it they want to become leaders or entrepreneurs? Like, kind of talk about, I'm just trying to get a pulse of what people are coming to you for.
Absolutely. One of the best certifications I got is in designing your life out of Stanford, where they talk about career and life design. And so part of designing your career is knowing how to network well and to bring up the sensitive topics without antagonizing the person you're with, right? So I'll give a quick example. Let's say someone is wanting a raise or a promotion. If they just say, hey, boss, I want a raise, can I have one? The directness is appreciated. The honesty is refreshing. And yet he's probably going to dig his heels in and probably give you the runaround and say, not Ed right now. But if you phrased it as a hypothetical where you said, hey, boss, how does someone like me get a raise at a company like this? Right now, it's a different feel, right? Because even if the boss is thinking, oh, this guy's just trying to get a raise, but you're not asking for a raise, you're asking for advice, right? And so that's a much more diplomatic way of bringing up the same topic without putting anyone on their heels or anything in an awkward situation. So whether it is, hey, boss, how does someone like me get a promotion at a company like this? Sounds a lot better than, hey, boss, I think I'm being underappreciated or overworked here. I think you should move me up, right? Maybe that works. Maybe you're going to have a strong enough relationship with your boss to do that, but more than likely you don't. And even then, that's not a dynamic you want to antagonize, because your boss is a very important relationship that you want to. Don't treat like fine china. You're afraid to break things, but you also don't want to punch it too hard either. And so other things people will ask for advice on is, hey, do I reframe and re-enlist where I am and just look at my current situation with fresh eyes? Do I have that discussion with my boss about redesigning my current responsibilities to focus more on what I love doing for the company and less of what just taxes my time? Do I have to relocate within the same company to say, hey, I want a different set of challenges and leverage my current warm network to get there? Or do I finally say, okay, I have to reinvent myself by going to grad school or starting my own business or making something different? So these are all very common questions when people ask me for career advice. It's less about me making recommendations for them as opposed to giving them a framework so they can come up with their own solution. And that's not including the interview questions that people want me to coach them through so that they iron out their phrasing and that they're able to articulate their thoughts accurately and tactfully. So those are a lot of the things that people ask for my help around.
Yeah, I know we have around 5 minutes remaining. And the question I have for you is, especially if you look at the corporate landscape of leadership, it's not very diverse or representative. And what trends or changes do you anticipate for diverse communities? And so our overarching question is, because if I look at emerging countries such as China and India, and they're coming out with Alibaba or Baidu, Tencent, these really fabulous companies. And then you look at Western companies and it's like this white male or older white male, and it's very, very aggressive. We have to outspoken. How do Asians become leaders in these type of paradigms? Because I see, there's a really great book called Quiet. Is it because some criticisms are quiet, soft spoken, not assertive? How do they navigate this if they want to become leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of it is, I think, recognizing that introversion is not a deal breaker for leaders. Some of the most effective leaders are actually introverts. So that's another side conversation. But part of it is, for anyone who aspires to be a leader, first you have to ask yourself, what is this company culture? How do they treat leadership? Revisiting the engineer that I mentioned previously, I asked him, because he wanted to move up into leadership, and I asked him, do you like who you're going to become in order to act like one of the boys? And he realized very quickly that was not the case. He knew he could have to adapt his style so that at work he would have to take on a certain persona. It's not to compromise his identity. It's just the kind of person he needs to be while at work. We don't want to go into the whole, oh, I'll have to wear masks for, friends and one for my bosses. That's not what we're advocating. What we are saying is, who do you have to be? And so if you go to a company like Alibaba and you look at their culture, and we always like to ask yourself, do you like who your leaders are becoming? We always say, they say, I want a promotion. I say, do you like what your boss does? Do you like the fact that he's overworked? And things like this. And they realize, you know what, maybe I don't want to have that promotion. Maybe there's just some more other things. But my initial advice and recommendations would be, hey, study the culture first. Because if you don't think this is a healthy culture where they actually support and equip and develop leaders well, then that's not a company you probably want to be at long term. It is something you're going to want to make the most of your opportunities there, adapt what you like, adopt what you like, and make sure you leave behind what you don't. But yeah, the first thing is just to say, what would I want in a company culture that I believe is conducive to developing confident and capable leaders? And then just having that rubric in mind to compare what your company actually does. And that way you can make a decision to either have the conversations, make some adjustments with them, or you may have to hop to another company sooner than you expect. But that's a simple answer for a very complicated situation.
I find them very fascinating because, for example, like in STEM or Silicon Valley, some of the most valuable companies are very heavily Asian dominated, and it's like China, and then just very. So I'm just curious how people listening to this, they're Asian and they want to progress, and how should they adopt their leadership style? Mentioning there was one really great resource you mentioned, the book, and what other resources, and how can people find you and reach out to you and follow you and contact you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have a book list. That client actually said I should try to sell it because he liked the list so much. And I was flattered because he didn't pay for it either. I was like, I don't know how I'm supposed to sell it when even my best advocate is still not paying for it. That's a whole other conversation. Yeah, so I mentioned Into Your Ship by Captain D. Michael Abrashoff. That's a great one. Other great books include The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner. That's a very comprehensive book. Other resources are John Maxwell's The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. If you want to start, I'd recommend those 3 books there. The framework I mentioned in this conversation, you can download for free off my website, adaptingleaders.com/guide. You can check out the free blog. You can book a complimentary 30-minute call or download the guide there. And then you can also connect with me on LinkedIn, whether you do 1, 2, or 3. Yeah, find me and I'll be happy to provide some support.
Yeah, really great conversation. I really enjoyed this. It hit an emotional home for me as well. I think a lot of people resonate and they can understand and thank you for your time and your expertise, and I keep up the great work.
Thanks. I hope this pays dividends for you and your listeners.